I have spent 6 years working as a maintenance technician for the city's sprawling subway system, a job I originally took not out of any romantic affection for the subterranean world, but simply because the pay was reliable and I needed the work. When I first started, the responsibilities seemed straightforward. Swap out burnt-out electrical assemblies, inspect aging wiring harnesses, and patch up the occasional subterranean water leak before it could erode the ballast. Yet, spending hours down there in that thick absolute darkness teaches you a sobering reality very quickly. The underground does not operate by the same rules as the sunlit world above. It feels like an entirely different ecosystem, a dense ancient environment where time loses its meaning, day and night blur together, and your primary connection to reality is the ambient symphony of the tunnels, or on rare and terrifying occasions the complete, unnatural absence of it. My senior partner during those shifts was Miller, a seasoned tech about 10 years my senior whose hair was prematurely graying, and whose skin seemed permanently tinged with the dusty gray pallor of the tunnels. Miller navigated the labyrinthine transit system with an almost supernatural familiarity, but his defining trait was his absolute refusal to ask questions about the anomalies we sometimes encountered. It was an ingrained defensive stoicism that I initially mistook for indifference, only to realize later that it was the purest form of survival instinct. The atmosphere in the maintenance break room shifted immediately the morning our supervisor assigned us to the Black Line, a moniker that was never spoken as a joke among the veteran transit crews, but rather uttered in careful, subdued murmurs. The Black Line was a remnant of an ambitious 1920s expansion project that had been abruptly decommissioned following a catastrophic, unexplained structural collapse. The tunnels were subsequently wiped from all public-facing transit maps, and officially designated by the city as non-existent. In practical terms, however, persistent rumors among the night crews suggested that rogue electrical currents still caused ancient fixtures to flicker in the void, and that bizarre, acoustic anomalies frequently echoed through the abandoned shafts. When our foreman called our four-man crew, comprising myself, Miller, and 2 younger technicians named Jackson and Lee, into his cramped office, he didn't offer any technical schematics or standard safety briefings. Instead, he unrolled a brittle yellowed blueprint across his metal desk, met our eyes with a heavy, unblinking gravity, and issued a single absolute directive. Once we crossed the threshold into the decommissioned sector, we were to maintain complete silence, avoid any frivolous banter, and above all else refrain from whistling. While Jackson smirked and I offered a hesitant nod, assuming the rule was merely an old-timer superstition rooted in the genuine hazards of subterranean echoes or acoustic triggers in unstable chambers, Miller's face remained carved from stone. A half-hour later we were descending into the earth aboard a rusted, open-cage utility elevator that groaned and rattled violently against its guide rails, plunging us into a damp atmosphere thick with the smell of ozone, wet brick, and decaying iron. Jackson tried to lighten the mood by checking his phone screen, joking about moving down into the tunnels to save on rent if the signal held up, while Lee offered a nervous, strained laugh about forgetting the surface world entirely. Miller, however, leaned motionless against the rattling metal mesh of the cage, rolling an unlit cigarette between his fingers and staring into the descending gloom with an icy intensity, quietly warning Jackson to pray that nothing in the dark ever learned his name. When the lift finally clattered to a halt at the bottom of the shaft, we faced a massive, riveted iron blast door bearing faded red stencil marks that warned of severe structural instability and restricted access. We threw the heavy mechanical deadbolts and put our shoulders into the iron door, which groaned in heavy protest as it swung inward to reveal a crushing, suffocating void where the air was entirely stagnant and completely devoid of the usual subterranean background noise. It felt as though ambient sound itself had been swallowed by the damp brick architecture, an acoustic dead zone that seemed to make Jackson instantly uncomfortable as he stepped forward and peered into the pitch-black corridor. Driven by a nervous urge to challenge the oppressive silence, Jackson pursed his lips and let out a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the heavy air like a physical projectile, echoing down the abandoned line before being swallowed entirely by the darkness. Before the final reverberation could fade, Miller moved with terrifying speed, seizing Jackson by the collar of his work jacket and slamming him hard against the damp masonry while hissing a ferocious command to remain silent. Jackson pushed him away indignantly, demanding to know if Miller was losing his mind over a harmless noise in an empty tunnel, but Miller simply looked at him with an expression of profound, paralyzing dread before turning his back and marching deeper into the gloom. For the first few hours, Our work proceeded without incident as the narrow beams of our industrial flashlights cut through swirling clouds of disturbed limestone dust, illuminating miles of corroded tracks and aging conduit boxes. The routine rhythm of maintenance briefly lulled me into a sense of normalcy until Jackson suddenly dropped his heavy wrench onto the ties with a dull thud, freezing in place and tilting his head toward the pitch-black tunnel stretching out ahead of us. His face lost all its color as he whispered that he could hear someone, or something, calling his name from the deeper shadows, a claim that Lee immediately tried to dismiss as a prank or stray radio interference from the surface. From the darkness just ahead, Miller's voice rang out with a cold, ruthless authority, commanding us to keep our eyes glued to our work and to completely ignore whatever acoustic tricks the tunnel was playing on our ears. By the time we paused for our scheduled break in a reinforced concrete electrical alcove, the psychological weight of the silence had taken a heavy toll. We ate our rations in complete muteness until Jackson, visibly shaking and desperate for relief from the ringing in his ears, pulled a pair of orange foam earplugs from his pocket. Miller lunged across the alcove and snatched the foam plugs right out of Jackson's trembling fingers before he could insert them, standing inches from the younger man's face as he explained in a venomous whisper that deliberately deafening oneself in these tunnels was a fatal mistake. He warned us that the acoustic phenomena in the black line were reactive, and that if whatever dwelled in the dark realized a trespasser could no longer hear their approach, they would seize the opportunity to close the distance unseen. A suffocating stillness descended over the alcove, broken moments later by a distinct, deliberate tapping sound originating directly from within the solid concrete retaining wall we were resting against, a hard rhythmic cadence like a piece of dense bone striking the interior rebar. As we backed away from the masonry, a garbled, distorted voice drifted out from the stone, sounding like a human attempting to speak while choking on mouthfuls of dry earth, slowly articulating the phrase that they knew we were there. Lee panicked, his flashlight beam trembling wildly across the damp ceiling as he begged us to confirm it was just a freak acoustic distortion. But Jackson seemed entirely entranced, stepping toward the vibrating wall and demanding to know who was hiding on the other side. Before Miller could physically restrain him, Jackson pressed his ear flat against the freezing concrete, his defiant posture instantly crumbling into a mask of absolute, paralyzing horror as he listened to the vibrations echoing from within the stone. He whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief, that the voice belonged to his mother, and that she was calling out to him from the dark, complaining about how freezing cold it was inside the wall. Miller violently dragged Jackson away from the masonry, throwing him to the floor and snarling that the phenomena only sought an acknowledgement, and that by responding, Jackson had willingly opened a line of communication with the tunnel's architecture. Instantly, the solitary tapping erupted into a cacophony of dozens of overlapping whispers, wet, raspy laughter, and the distinct, agonizing sound of fingernails scratching frantically against the other side of the concrete barrier, surrounding us completely. Then, with the abruptness of a severed wire, the overwhelming noise vanished, plunging the alcove back into a dead, pressurized silence as our heavy-duty flashlights began to flicker and sputter violently. From the absolute center of the pitch-black tunnel ahead, a solitary sound cut through the darkness, a sharp two-toned whistle that was the exact, undeniable melodic duplicate of the note Jackson had playfully cast into the void hours earlier, only returned to us at an impossibly slow, deliberate tempo. Jackson collapsed onto his knees, tears carving clean lines through the limestone dust on his cheeks as his psychological defenses shattered entirely, while Lee completely lost his nerve and bolted toward the direction of the utility elevator. Miller intercepted Lee with a brutal tackle, pinning him against the tunnel wall, and warning us with chilling certainty that running blindly into the dark would only provoke the surrounding environment to treat us like prey. While our attention was diverted trying to subdue Lee, Jackson rose to his feet with an unsettling fluid grace, his eyes wide and completely devoid of recognition as he stared past us into the absolute blackness of the uncharted line. Murmuring that he couldn't leave his mother alone in the freezing dark, he stepped off the concrete platform and walked directly into the shadows, his flashlight beam dancing erratically across the aging brickwork before being snuffed out entirely. I lunged forward to grab his jacket, but Miller threw his heavy arm across my chest, anchoring me to the spot with immense physical force and stating flatly that Jackson was already gone the moment he answered the call. A split second later, a horrific, sickening sound echoed from the darkness ahead, a violent acoustic impression of shifting mass and sudden, overwhelming physical force that ended without a single cry of pain, leaving only the sound of rattling gravel settling on the tracks. Lee dropped to the floor, his hands clamped over his ears, but the psychological terror overwhelmed him entirely, tearing a raw, piercing scream of Jackson's name from his throat that bounced endlessly down the corridor. That vocalization proved to be a catastrophic mistake. Before the echoes of his scream could even dissipate, dozens of distorted, mocking voices blasted back from every direction in the darkness, flawlessly mimicking the exact pitch and terror of Lee's scream in a deafening demonic chorus. At that exact moment, our remaining overhead lights failed completely, leaving us engulfed in total darkness save for the pathetic, dying glow of a miniature penlight I managed to pull from my utility vest. When I clicked the tiny beam on and swept it across the floor where Lee had just been kneeling, the space was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no displaced equipment, only his industrial flashlight rolling slowly in a circle across the wooden railway ties. Miller clamped his hand onto my shoulder with a grip like a steel vise, pulling me around and screaming at me to run toward the elevator shaft without looking back or making a sound. We sprinted blindly through the pitch-black corridor, our boots splashing through freezing puddles of subterranean runoff, pursued not by the sound of running footsteps, but by a horrific, synchronized scraping noise that seemed to slither along the brick walls and ceiling directly above our heads. When we finally crashed into the heavy iron blast door at the entrance of the sector, Miller hurled me through the opening onto the safety of the elevator platform, but physically blocked the doorway himself, grabbing the massive interior handle to pull the iron portal shut from the wrong side. I turned and screamed for him to step through the frame before the latch engaged. But as he looked back at me through the narrowing gap, his usual stoic expression had been replaced by an unsettling, profound expression of peace. He spoke with an eerie, quiet clarity, stating that he had been a permanent part of the Black Line for a very long time, and then his face transformed as his lips pulled back into an impossibly wide, jagged grin that seemed to stretch the very fabric of his features. As the heavy iron door slammed shut, engaging its mechanical bolts with a deafening vault-like clang, my penlight beam caught a glimpse of the darkness behind him, where dozens of pale, hollow faces had materialized from the void, every single one of them wearing that exact same unnatural, smiling expression. I pounded my fists against the elevator controls, sending the ancient lift clattering up the shaft just as the heavy iron door below began to shudder and groan under the weight of something violently hammering against the metal from the inside. All the way up the long, dark vertical climb to the surface, a synchronized chorus of whistles echoed up the shaft, slowly morphing into a flawless, mocking imitation of my own voice gently calling my own name back down into the deep. In the weeks that followed, the official Transit Authority incident report categorized the loss of Jackson and Lee as the tragic result of a localized, accidental ceiling collapse during routine infrastructure maintenance, though extensive specialized recovery excavations failed to retrieve any trace of their equipment. The truly chilling revelation occurred when I sat in the HR director's office to file my mandatory witness statements. The supervisor looked at me with a bloodless, trembling expression and turned the personnel manifests around to show me that no technician matching Miller's name, description, or employee ID had ever been on the city's payroll. He insisted, his voice cracking with genuine confusion, that the work order had only ever authorized a three-man crew consisting of myself, Jackson, and Lee, and that the fourth man I was so frantically describing simply did not exist in any official record. I stood up from the desk, walked out of the Transit Authority headquarters without signing my final paperwork or claiming my remaining wages, and severed all ties with the subterranean infrastructure of the city forever. Today, I live in a quiet, sun-drenched rural community several hundred miles away from the metropolitan sprawl, residing in a third-floor apartment specifically chosen so I can sleep with solid, sunlit air beneath my floorboards rather than the earth. I manage a profound, lingering diagnosis of severe post-traumatic stress, relying on a strict regimen of medication and keeping every light in my apartment burning brightly from dusk until dawn to keep the shadows at bay. The concept of absolute silence has become entirely intolerable to me. I maintain a constant background hum of televisions, radios, and white noise machines running 24 hours a day, because whenever a room falls completely quiet, my auditory cortex begins to search for the rhythmic tapping of bone against concrete. I cannot step foot inside an underground parking garage, a basement, or a pedestrian subway tunnel without suffering debilitating panic attacks, as even the faintest scent of damp masonry or oxidized iron causes my chest to tighten and my throat to constrict. While I do not experience supernatural visions in my waking life, the moment I close my eyes at night, my memory traps me in a relentless loop. I see Jackson stepping calmly into the void. I hear Lee's final scream shattering into 1,000 mocking echoes, and standing at the center of the dark is the man who never existed, wearing that impossible, timeless grin.